That actually is one of the things that I regret about AI, at least right now, which I think we'll overcome as a society, is the invasion into critical thinking skills for younger people. It's almost like the calculator is for math.
Welcome to season 2 of the What I Think podcast. We're thrilled to kick off this season with a true trailblazer, Neil Hoyne, a leading expert in data and marketing strategy. Neil's journey began in Chicago and took him to Purdue University and UCLA Anderson School of Management. At Google, he revolutionized advertising as program manager for display advertising insights, driving a remarkable 9.8% annual growth in their $5 billion display network. As global program manager for marketing attribution, he generated $1.2 billion in incremental revenue by bringing transparency to marketing investments. Now serving as Chief Strategist at Google, Neil leads initiatives that drive an average 8.2% increase in advertising spend among clients. He's also a best-selling author of Converted, with his upcoming book, Tournaments, set to explore corporate leadership dynamics. So join us as we dive into Neil's insights on navigating the age of AI, leveraging data to identify and pursue key marketing strategies as we uncover the human stories behind the numbers. This season is proudly sponsored by Sideshow Tea, fueling our conversations with premium single origin tea infused with sparkling water. Welcome, Neil.
Derek, thank you so much for having me.
Tell me about being a chief strategic officer. What specifically is that now?
Here's the basic way that I explain it, is less internal, more external, where there are companies around the world that are trying to figure out. Today, it's AI, but previously you could say it was big data, it was cloud. When I joined, it was mobile strategy. CMOs wondering, do we really need a mobile website or app? Yes, I was there. It's been 15 years I've been there. I went through that evolution. And oftentimes at those high levels of organizations, it gets lonely, right? CMOs, CEOs are rarely going to go to their directs and say, I don't have the answer. They're certainly not going to go to their boards and say, I don't have the answer. And even from their own experience, maybe they have the company that they're at and maybe a half dozen that they saw beforehand. And I serve as an advisor to them, not promoting Google or its products, but just saying what might happen. How might we approach these problems? What tools or what strategies could I use for the next level of my organization? Or for some of them, what are just the mistakes that I need to avoid? And so I do that candidly and from a trusted position of working with several hundred companies every year in nearly every corner of the globe, in nearly every vertical. And over time, I have the natural tendency of finding out those patterns as to where some companies can see the same opportunity, have the same customers, the same data, and come to wildly different conclusions about what that means to them. And so it's not that I'd ever go to a company and I say, this is a direction you need to go. That's not my decision to make. But I say, this is the information you need. These are the questions you need to consider. This is how you probably want to think about this problem. And if I'm offering them good enough guidance, one is I like to think they come back to me. The second is the company does a lot better than they would have done if I wasn't there. And so that's really the role that I play. And so I'm really at the disposal of some of our largest advertisers where they will come to Mountain View to meet with me. I will travel to go see them. And we just have these honest conversations about these are the things that are changing the world that we're uncertain about or need to pay attention to. And so it's a really fascinating and privileged position. I couldn't tell you how anyone deliberately ends up in this role, but a lot of it had to do with when I joined Google and you mentioned in the introduction, they hired me as an analyst, which was looking at numbers and figuring out how we get people to click on pictures. That was the job. Display ads, how do we get people to click? And I saw a contrast from when I was at UCLA, which was when I was at UCLA and a CMO came to campus, it was standing room only in the largest auditorium. You were stretching to hope that somebody would answer your question. And if they didn't, better luck next time. And at Google, I found those same executives were coming and meeting with people and there were empty seats in the room. And I said, wait a minute, in between my regular meetings and my day job, could I just sit and could I listen? And it became probably the closest thing I have to an addiction of anything, of just listening to how all of these executives and board members and celebrities and politicians explain their problems, explain their views of the world. And there was never any intentionality behind just learning. And after doing that for several thousand hours, somebody went through my calendar and figured it out. Then they started looking back at me, this guy sitting in the corner and saying, what do you think? I was like, you're the executives. I'm the young, I still have a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn. And they're like, no, what do you think? And so I told them, as it turns out, that guidance they found valuable. And so even despite my hesitation, that changed the dynamics where it became one where I wanted to get invited to these meetings simply to learn from these other people who have been in industry for so long, to now I was getting invited to meetings where they were asking me to share these thoughts. And after doing that for a while, eventually a decision was made by our president at the time, Alan Tegeson. He's like, we're just going to create a position so you do this all the time. And I told him, I'm like, what exactly am I doing all the time? He's like, exactly what you're doing, just do that more. So they give you a nice title, they put you in a different office, and that's been my career ever since.
Love that. That's an amazing story. I think that, and that maybe that's a part of the inherent culture at Google too, as well. Would you say that's something that differentiates itself and why it's such a good company? By the way, I'll tell you a quick story about me, because when I was at DoubleClick, this was the time, this is way back in 2000, where all the video game rooms were there.
They still have them. They still have them.
They're you at foosball. Or you at foosball and ping pong. But this was new. I felt this was a new in the workplace. And I got to tell you that I started out as an account engineer, and I started doing my job very quickly. So I would spend a lot of time in the game room until one day I told my boss, I said, look, I think I'm playing more than working. Is there anything we can do?
You told your boss that?
Yeah, I told my boss that. Get fired. I'd come back and be sweating, and I'm just saying, I think then they promoted me and made me as a project manager. And I was sent out to Silicon Valley to handle NetGravity's acquisition. But I think certainly you're very humble about your abilities, because I think not a lot of people have the same perspective. And I'd see that you're offering something different, but it's also fact-based and data-driven.
It has to be. It has to be. And I'll add on to it. I think something that I worry about is that oftentimes where my value comes from is that at the top of many of these organizations, it becomes the hardest to get an honest perspective about what's happening. You're the furthest from the customers at times. You're the furthest from the junior analysts who feel intimidated to talk to you. And those people are oftentimes the ones going through the raw data. And so that idea of truth with position often diminishes. There was one executive who shall remain nameless for reasons you'll understand in a moment, where he prided himself in the biographies that he's been a part of about his life and his career, about transparency, the importance of honesty and candor across his executive team. And so obviously this was someone I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to see how this worked. And then I was surprised with how scripted his team was presenting to him. They knew the decisions they needed to lead him to. They had hand signals across the table, similar to a game of baseball, where they're signing so they would know when to move on, when to focus on a number, when they thought they were winning the case, when to abandon it and bring it up. And on the opposite side of the table, he's like, look at how honest and open we're being. We all get along. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I know for a fact they had a half dozen meetings to agree on everything that they were going to tell you and what they weren't. And so it just becomes difficult. And so I always look at myself as to say, I want to relate more to the customers and to the new hires, the entry-level analysts, than I do to any executive, because I think those are the ones where the true insights lie. I think every company eventually gets so compartmentalized with their ideas that innovation struggles because they think they have all the answers. And so I always like to approach it to say, I don't have any of the right answers, but what I have are some really great tools and processes learned over time that help those good answers surface from other people.
Definitely. Tell me more about your quote. Every algorithm knows what your customers want. Almost no one asks what they need. Are you ready to ask better questions? Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
An attempt at being provocative text. So I'll tell you this. I'll say that algorithms are very good at understanding within the context of what we collect and what we have. But the context of where something comes from matters. And a good example is I spent some time a couple of years ago with, as they call them, the ladies and gentlemen of the Ritz-Carlton. And what I was surprised to find out was that not only do they have their values, what they call a credo card, part of their uniform in their jacket pocket, in their other jacket pocket at that time, and they still may, was what they had was called a preference pad. So a notepad where they would capture the preferences of individual guests. And so they would go down and maybe you're by the pool and you, hey, can I get you a beer? I would love a Corona. And so they could write that preference down. It gets entered into a CRM system tied to an algorithm. And now they would know what to serve you at all stays and to personalize your journey. But was that really your favorite beer? Or was it the people you were with? Was it the context? You're sitting outside and it's hot. And sometimes when we rely on algorithms, we just say they're going to tell us what's best. But I think there's that personal layer where you need to understand the situation, be able to ask other questions to refine that data. And so I think there's a kind of a push and pull where algorithms can force things on us and say, this is what the algorithm thinks is best, but it's dependent on how well was that data captured. And what I find to be sad, actually, in the modern era is that a lot of people are willing to defer to these algorithms by saying, we studied this, we entered this information, it's in their profile, this is what I should do next. And they almost suppress that human intuition to connect and to be curious and to ask questions in favor of an automated platform. And so I always go there, and this is a reason why that quote exists, is to encourage companies and individuals to realize that these algorithms are subject to every bias we have as human beings. They are far from perfect. There's certain situations where they're better than anything we could do on our own. But I want to get back to where human beings actually have curiosity, can have connections with people, can uncover something new and go well beyond anything that those algorithms are capable of, just because we know how to connect with people.
Then how does one ask better questions? I think, are we saying having more life experience? Is that something that you encourage or foster? Or
I would say it's not only life experience, but I'd say the defining trait, both of my career, people that I've seen be successful at all levels of companies, is that unending curiosity about the world. Like, here's the way I would contrast it. I work with a lot of young professionals who are new in their career, and they're quick to defer to senior leaders. You teach me how you do it, and then I will do that, and that's how I get promoted, right? I do it the way the company does it. And there's some greatness in that because you're learning from what the organization does. You're borrowing the best practices from a large organization, but they don't ask why. They don't ask why it's been done that way. And so they don't know how to improve it. They don't know where the weaknesses are. They don't know if they can apply it someplace else. It's, we gave you this hammer. Everything becomes that proverbial nail. This is what I'll use every time. But they never understand why. They never understand the history of the process. And often when you dig in, you realize that there's ways that your perspective can be added to make that process better, or maybe abandoned altogether. But instead, you're almost condemned to just reinforcing what you've already done. It's like at some of these legacy consumer packaged companies, deodorants, razors, paper towels, where they have formulas for how they reach their consumers, right? This is what the ad has to look like. This is what product shot, individual using the product, another product shot, and nobody gets fired for using these formulas. And then they get disrupted by some college kids that just have a couple bucks that create an ad that nobody's ever seen before. And you see kind of disparity there where they're like, that is incredible. They're like, why can't we do something like this? Fraction of the cost, 10 times the reach. And then immediately they go through, okay, so this should be a formula, right? Let's dissect this into a formula. And it's because they're trying to fit it into those models. And so really what it comes down to is more and more people should not only respect the history of the programs, the processes, and the companies that they're part of, but have that curiosity to ask why we do it and have the strength to challenge it from that level of curiosity, say, I see something wrong. I see something could be better. Instead, I see a lot of people pull back and say, it's always been done this way, so we'll continue to do it that way. And then their growth, their company's growth never evolves.
And this, I could see what you're saying is that leadership has a big impact on how the employees and your team work. Has there ever been a time where you were like, hey guys, we should do this? And then maybe you could take me through that process of maybe you were challenged by that decision. I'm fairly confident to say that most decisions aren't 100%. There's always this degree of variability.
No, God, no.
Take me through it. Like, how do you navigate that? And one of the things that I don't think I ever did well in corporate was like dealing with different people. And I was a very straightforward guy. So you're navigating corporate processes as well. And that those are never just, okay, let's go do it. So
you always think they are. Right? You come from school where there's a right answer, right? You take an exam. This is the answer. And if I write this answer down, I'm rewarded with points, with good marks. And then you get into the corporate world and you're like, I found the right answer. And I have to level with some of these junior analysts. I say, the easiest way to get promoted in Silicon Valley is if you're running data, if you're running a test, if your answer agrees with what your boss thinks It should be that you did the best work possible. If you challenge their thinking, they will challenge every part of your methodology because it conflicts with what they believe should happen. And that's tough for them because they're saying, wait, data-driven company, data-driven culture, the data should decide, right? Not really, because we're human beings. And so even though we may see the absolute right answer for anything, we're confronted with, how does this affect my promotion chances? How does this affect my team size, my budget, my travel? And I learned that, I'll be honest, at Google, I had an analysis one time that found out that one of the fundamental parts of our advertising strategy were wrong. Like one of the metrics when I was looking in the plan for the next year, I looked at this and I'm like, this is fundamentally incorrect. And the reason, to simplify it down, was that what they were calling the metric was calculated in an entirely different way than what it was intended to be. So it was intended to represent X, and it was the furthest from that picture. So it's like, you can chase this all you want. This does not represent your world. And so I was proud of myself for finding this. I was like, look how much money we're going to save. And so I presented it to a vice president at the time, and he listens to my case. He reviews the data, and then he pauses and he's like, so it's like, Neil, what you're telling me based on this analysis is that I need to now go to my boss, the president of the organization, and tell them that their entire strategy is wrong. And then they need to go through every stakeholder and they need to revise their individual strategies based on your analysis. That's the news you want me to deliver to the president. You want me to be that person. And I just kind of said, this is an intimidating fellow. I was like, no, you don't have to. And he's okay. Thank you very much. And all of a sudden I had his seal of approval. I was telling him that I would leave it there and that he could go on with this because it wasn't worth the battle. And for people that listen to this, they may get a little jaded and they may say, hey, what does this mean for data? What does this mean for decision making if these politics continue to get involved? And I say, this is the constant that I've learned, and this is the great insight from it, is that it exists at every company. Every company wrestles with these very same problems because we're all human. And so the goal of leaders is to be able to manage that tension of the politics, but also the opportunity of nudging the organization in the right direction. I think a lot of people, when they enter the workforce, are like, we're going to do everything perfect. We're going to study the data. We're going to be very precise. And those ambitions are there, but then there also has to be that balance from learned experience to say, how much change can an organization accept? And those tend to be entirely different things. And for leaders, it's being able to be in touch with that. I think a lot of leaders can come in by virtue of their position and just knock over everything. And they certainly can. But then the culture pushes back on them. And then things aren't working. And they see this right now with AI that we can talk about. They're like, I'm trying to push this through and the culture is pushing back on me. Why is that? And it's because you're not in tune with what's actually necessary to drive these changes, about the very human concerns that people have about their job, about their career prospects, about their budgets, about their promotions. That's slowing down the work that needs to get done. And so that's what the great leaders are, is they're attuned both to the data, but that emotional connection to say, here's what the right answer is, and here's what the organization will be able to accept.
I think this is a good bridge to AI. And I definitely want to hear your opinion and your definition, because you're one of the most influential people. If you didn't know it, you are one of the most influential people, because you're a driving force in the strategy of what algorithms do. And certainly Google is one of the most used, if not the most used platform in the world. What is your definition of AI first? And then let's continue that conversation about AI.
I have a very classic definition of AI, which is it's really teaching or guiding computers to do things that previously were uniquely human, like how to learn, how to build a creative. And I'm not talking about the methods by which they derive it. I think a lot of people go underneath to say, that's pattern matching, or you're simply following this algorithm or this model. I care more about the inputs and outputs. It's saying, can a computer learn a task on its own? Can it improve that task? Can it come up with new hypotheses? Can it do it across multiple domains? What does it use as its source, and how far can you extend that? If we go into the physical space, can it understand what's sitting on your desk? Can it understand the context of those elements? With robotics, if you were to give it a task to move an object into another object, can it understand that in space? Can it teach itself in scenarios that you didn't pre-program? That's generally how I look at AI. AI, artificial intelligence. If we look at human beings as being distinctly intelligent, can it replicate that through the basis of commands, of models, and of data?
based on what you know of AI, do you think superintelligence is possible?
On a long enough timeline, I'd say anything's possible. I think the question would be, do I see it happening eminently? I think that a lot of people are looking at AI as being on a linear trajectory where everything gets better at a constant rate, or exponential for people that point to these ideas like the singularity. Like we'll get to a point where the growth is just completely out of control. I look at it more as it will follow a curve where we make a lot of advances, things slow down a little bit, more breakthroughs and investment happen, then it speeds up, then it slows down, we catch our breath, we adapt it to new markets. And so I don't, at least from where I sit, my opinion is to say it is possible. A lot of things are possible, but it's not something that I look at as eminent to say it is absolutely coming. But it also opens up that wider question whenever we speculate about things like superintelligence or AGI or the singularity and all these technical terms, there becomes a lot of gray area by saying, what do we mean? Like when people say, our computer is intelligent, and I say, that's an interesting definition. I know some human beings that aren't intelligent, so are they less human? Or does that make our achievements? Because computers are, people sometimes joke, they're like, AI is a 6-year-old doing this problem. It's great, but they still need supervision. Does that make it any less impressive? Were you expecting them to be perfect all the time? But those are some of the questions we have to ask and say, what do we define as intelligence as a whole? And is that a necessity for us to say that these innovations are credible? And so the same thing with superintelligence. More intelligent than human beings? If so, who? And across all domains or just one? And so it enters into a game where I'm less interested in the labels and I'm more interested in saying, how does it improve our lives? How does it improve our creativity? How does it improve the possibilities? Can we do things now as individuals that used to take us 3 or 5 years or be without our reach? There was a study that came out yesterday where they were looking at cancer treatments with one of these models, and where it looked at existing data and it found a hypothesis that human beings didn't consider. And I say that's pretty intelligent in my book. Where's the standard of what else it needs to do in order for you to be impressed? And so that's a debate where I look more at the outputs and the changes it makes than some imaginary benchmark that we think we need to hit.
Can I ask you, I saw the post on your LinkedIn and I encourage any of our audience to definitely follow you because it's very informative. But what do you think the key challenges are in arriving at some of these breakthroughs for key industries, let's say the medical profession, for example?
I think with the breakthroughs, I think data quality, data bias are front and center. These models are built on what we know, on human knowledge, and human knowledge is not necessarily fair or unbiased. So how do you build these systems that are representative? There was an academic study, I think 1.5 years ago, that said a lot of these values of these large language models reflect Western values. Well, that's limiting to people in other parts of the world, but also we don't share in their experiences, their perspectives, their approaches. And so it starts with the data that we're using and how we understand it. The other challenge that we have is actually a distinctly human one, which is how do we adapt when you have a technology that challenges who we are as individuals, where we find value? So if you're an artist, and we saw this in some of the early image generation models, where you're an artist and you work and you perfect your craft over decades, maybe you have a team and this goes on for generations, and then an AI model copies that. How do you feel about your value? How do we feel about music? AI created versus not. How do we feel about the truth in the world? An AI generated image versus not. And I think that's the rapid change that we have to get accustomed to. And I don't have any easy answers to it. A good friend and colleague of mine, Gopi, has this interesting metaphor where people often ask about this change that can be very scary. And our CEO, Sundar, was on 60 Minutes probably a year ago talking about how he sees AI as impressive as innovation as fire. And it makes an appropriate metaphor because when fire was first discovered, you imagine that some caves probably burned down. Some people probably got carbon monoxide poisoning. They burned their food, probably got hurt falling into that fire. But now we look at anywhere we're at where we have flammability standards. We have fire departments. We have insurance. We have fire extinguishers. We know how to handle that force. But there was still that learning curve in between where society needed to adapt to say bad things can happen, but we can't abandon the benefits of this technology. I think we're witnessing that at an accelerated pace with AI. where with our jobs, with our identity, with our economies, we're now saying, what does this change mean? And how do we do this in a way that's net positive for everybody? And so that I think is the more important part, is to get people to use these tools and businesses to transform with them. It's really also understanding, how do we identify with ourselves and our jobs given this new force?
Like you said, I think a lot of the challenges are in the data. I'd love to transition to talk about your book, which I greatly enjoyed. I will tell everybody that it was the Audible version. And it was...
Oh, you had to listen to me for 3.5 hours.
I did.
I'm sorry. Actually, can I tell you an anecdote about the audiobook? This will come
Absolutely,
out soon.
Yes, of course.
At the end of recording the audiobook, I thought, and maybe the audience does too, that recording audiobooks would be glamorous. I think you get into this nice recording studio with mixer panels and those technicians. No, in reality, at least with Penguin, they stuck me in a closet on the Stanford University campus. The technology straight out of the 70s, and worse off, a creaky chair, right? So you have to stay perfectly still, or they're very sensitive microphones pick it up. Even around lunchtime, your stomach growls, the microphone picks it up. So after doing this for a little bit more than 3 days, at the end they say, hey, this is great. Can we do a PR segment to help promote the audiobook? I said, absolutely. And they said, all right, the first question, if you didn't narrate this book, who would you have chosen to do it? Now, right away, like most people, I start thinking, I'm like, Morgan Freeman would be fantastic.
Yeah, that's exactly what.
James Earl Jones at the time. I was like, yes. I was like, could you imagine my book being read? It would be like, just be beautiful. And before I can finish my list of top 3 or 4, the editor chimes in over like, he's like, I'm sorry, you can't pick those. And I'm like, why not? And he's like, everybody picks those. Pick someone else. And so I start firing off all the top talent I know. And just at this point, I'm just punching. I know it's a marketing book. And so who would it be? At that time, he was still with us. Gilbert Gottfried. Gilbert Gottfried.
Are you serious?
Comedian that people don't know, the voice of the parrot in the Disney classic Aladdin. And I guess the editor thought I wasn't taking the question seriously because he didn't have a second, third, fourth question. It was just that, thank you very much. And I don't think that interview ever went live. But as I was driving back from Stanford's campus in Palo Alto back home, I was sitting there and I was still troubled by it. I think I was just having a grumpy day. And I was sitting at a light and I'm like, you know what? I know what I'm going to do. So I sent Gilbert a note with the story asking him if he would record a portion of my audiobook for me. And he did. So I have the first couple pages of my book narrated by Gilbert Gottfried. It is as hilarious and as great, and you can only get through the first couple pages, but it is exactly what you would expect. And sadly, he passes away several months later. And so it stays in my archives. It's on my Google Drive. I don't want it to seem like a commercial entity, but I often joke whenever I hear about the audiobook, I say the best thing that came out of the audiobook was having such a talent like Gilbert Gottfried read a book about business marketing as part of that project. Completely unrelated, I know the audiobook. That is one of the behind the scenes stories where I was like, wow. And I listened to it and I had tears coming out of my eyes. I'm like, this is hilarious. And then he passed away. And I was like, I can't release this now. I don't want to be profiting from anything. And I reached out to his estate, to his old age, and I haven't heard back, but it is out there. And so I think I'm like, that's the real version of the audiobook. That's the best version of the audiobook. What you had was probably number 2.
Yeah, I would definitely pay heavily to try to get a hold of that recording just to hear those pages because I would be cracking up.
Here's what I'll tell you that I always think about with that story is that oftentimes we go into projects. Like the book itself was never meant to be a book. It was meant to be a Kindle PDF that just turned out in such a way that Penguin ended up buying it 72 hours after they saw the finished draft. It wasn't even when I worked with their editors during the writing process. I think this is kind of a larger lesson I've taken away with a lot of things. It's something I pass along to younger groups that I work with, is that especially those interested in strategy, those that come out of maybe business plan classes at school, where there's this obsession with being able to plan for every contingency of what's going to happen, what's going to turn into a project. And it keeps too many people from ever starting down that path of creating something. And so even with this book, if I sat down and someone said, so Neil, you're going to be writing a book that's going to be published in multiple languages and Gilbert Gottfried's going to do the audiobook, the amount of pressure on me to satisfy that audience and to reach some artificial goals for sales or reach to the book or what success means would probably have kept me from ever writing that book. And I know because early on, when I thought about the audience, when everyone starts a project or a new venture, they always think, who's the target market? Who do you want to impress? At Google, they say, you're writing a press release for the product, right? They summon the spirit of Steve Jobs. Imagine standing on stage and announcing this product to the world. And you set those expectations so high that it makes it difficult for you to actually follow passion. Now you're trying to please that audience. And in fact, when I started crafting this even PDF, given the audience I work with, I said, I'm going to send this to CEOs and CMOs. And you start adopting a language not of who you are, but who pleases that group, right? The CEOs talk in a certain way. They love seeing a 2x2 matrix. That's what we do in consulting presentations. We got 2x2s, and here's your chart, and here's your framework. I remember my son came in, and he was about 3 years old. And he was just really curious as to what I was doing on the keyboard, right? He's not reading, but he's just, wow, his papa's spending a lot of time doing this. And then I just decided, I said, you know what? I'm just going to write this book for you. I'm going to write it to an audience of one, which means I know you'll love me regardless of the book, and I'll never lie to you about it. And if somebody happens to read the book beyond you and they find use of it, then great. But it was just with those expectations tapered that all of a sudden you let things come forward that you're not planning, that you can adjust to. That's where that toolkit comes into place. But it leads to beautiful consequences that you can never have anticipated on the onset of that project. And it's one of those things, just when I look at people now with their careers, and they're like, how do I plan a career in the era of AI? So who the hell knows? I don't know what we're going to see in 5 years. Maybe I'm wrong about superintelligence and people find something great. I say, what you have now is, how do you do the best with the skills and the opportunity you have today, and to continue to build those skills so that no matter what happens, you know how to change and adapt. That's the reason you're in school. That's the reason you're learning from other people, not to sit there and to wait while you're planning a perfect career strategy in an era of great uncertainty.
How old is your son?
He's 8 right now.
Oh, my son is 8 as well.
It's a fun age, right? They start questioning. He can start reading my emails. He goes into Canva. And comes back. And I was like, he's like, look what I made in Canva. And I was like, I didn't know they were teaching this in school. And he's like, they're not. And he's like, look at the music I made. He's like, interestingly enough, AI principles at least are taught at the schools out here. He's like, I used AI to make this music. I was like, you did? And he's like, but don't worry, Papa. He said, I started with my idea and my inspiration, and the AI just helped me because I don't know the instruments. And I was like, how strange this is that I looked at it and say, if I didn't know the instruments when I was growing up, I couldn't create something. And now for him, it's not even a limitation. It's there. It's always been there. Now the question is, what do I want to create with it? And that's kind of neat.
Yeah, my son, their school is fantastic, and they embrace technology as well. And I think that's something we have to do, and it's growing alongside, especially AI, it's growing alongside him. And we're just adapting, honestly. We're just adapting to screen time and how to manage that.
Screen time, addiction to social media. These are the challenges, right? Every generation has to figure out how they do and how they navigate the circumstances, the families, the people they care about, and the changes in this world. And that's the fun part about not necessarily giving in the same way with companies. You can't give them right or wrong answers. If my son ever came in and said, should I take this job or that job? Even if I knew the answer, I think about the CEOs that are like, should I acquire this company or not? I don't want to give him the answer. He needs to come to that answer. What I prefer to do is give him the ways to think about the problem. And so he can come to the own conclusion and own that. And even if it turns out to be a failure, to figure out how you make something of that, so that even if it didn't turn out the way that you wanted, I think those skills are more valuable. That actually is one of the things that I regret about AI, at least right now, which I think we'll overcome as a society, is the invasion into critical thinking skills for younger people. It's almost like the calculator is for math. My son has not seen a calculator, at least in this household. Never shown him the app on my phone. He doesn't know the old TI-83 calculator I have from college. He doesn't know it exists. Because the temptation of doing his basic multiplication and division in school, say, look, this solves it, and it gets the right answer. It gets what the teacher wants, versus the skills to say, to do it the hard way and to learn. That's going to be a difficult lesson, is we're telling younger people, it's like, you need to go through to read the book, even though an LLM can tell you the answers. You need to go and search for the information, even though an LLM can tell you what it thinks the market predictions are just by prompting that question. and that there's value in being able to ask and to challenge the results that you're given. Otherwise, how do we improve?
Love it. I'm going through the same things where you get to memorize the multiplication tables.
Yes.
I don't know.
I got one of those grids. Got little buttons he's got to hit when he gets everyone, and the teacher scores, and they're like, he needs to have all these. It's fun to watch people learn. I'll share something with you, which is interesting. This was a study that came. I was at South by Southwest a couple months ago, and we were talking about AI and how does it infringe on our identity. And this is something true for someone in elementary school who's going to say, I'm really good at this, or is AI really good at this? To later in life, are we going to have a crisis of confidence? And what does this mean, how we embrace technology? And especially for companies, how do you get people to follow along if you challenge that identity? And there was a study that came up where they asked a bunch of bakers, simple task, you're making some bread, how they felt about automation. I said, look, making bread is pretty standardized. You have a recipe. We have robots that can go through the process. You can make consistently higher quality, lower cost. How do you feel about automating your bakery? And everybody hated the idea, right? There was something to challenge that identity, as we now see with AI. But there was an interesting nuance in that study where instead of simply taking the answers for what they are, that people didn't want automation or that it wasn't going to happen, they went back to those participants and they said, what is it that you really do in your job that you feel is core to that identity? Baker may be too simplistic. And what they actually found is they found out that there were some bakers, and I'm simplifying this, that really associated with the science of making bread. I said the temperature, the humidity, the yeast, like the chemistry of it all, that is where that precision is what I love. And there were other people that more closely aligned with the physical nature, being able to feel the dough and knowing if it had the right consistency, right? Being able to look at it, observe, and say, this bread is ready, this is perfect, or something's wrong and it needs to be thrown away. And oddly enough, both groups were distinct in the fact that they didn't like the other side. The people that found their identity with the chemistry of bread hated the manual labor. And the people that loved the manual labor hated the chemistry part. And so when you broke it down, you said, what if you automated the part of the job that you never associated with to begin with? Then all of a sudden the value came through because it was, wait a minute, you mean I get to spend more time doing what I really think I do best? And when they saw that connection, then they were happy to embrace that automation because they saw that not that their identity was being challenged, but their identity was being reinforced. I get to do more of the things that make me, even though those were different. And so it actually ties now when I look at people who are in that job hunt, it's kind of that question for them in this AI era, especially for kids coming up. What is it that you find makes you special? That makes your heart float, the stuff that you couldn't be torn away from? And what are the things that you would be happy never to touch again? And maybe so part of the answer is we just become really specialized at those things that we're naturally great at to do something new with. And all that stuff that we never liked to begin with, that's where we find all the automation and all the AI really works well because it's at that intersection of things that AI can do really well and things we don't want to do at all without challenging our identity. But the first step to it is I don't think we ask. I think we just assume you're the baker, right? You're the coder, you're the artist, and we can just replace that role. I don't think we can. I think we're going to replace parts of the role that people never wanted to do anyways.
Love it. Let's take it from the beginning. Tell me about your being a Chicago soul and your time at Purdue and UCLA.
It's where I grew up, the first 25 years of my life. Gritty, hardworking people. My wife, who actually grew up in the city, reminds me that I grew up in the suburbs, which is a significantly different experience. And so I own that. I grew up around chain stores, new housing, suburb, classic stuff. I ended up at Purdue University because of my interest at the time in computer science. And Purdue, I believe, had one of the first computer science programs in the country and a progressive one, teaching languages like Java when they were just a couple years old. And so that's where I wanted to be. I figured I'll stay in the Midwest with people I understand. And I learned very quickly that my interest of computers was really more from a hobbyist mindset than professional. And so it was more, I liked tinkering. I liked breaking things and rebuilding them. I remember some of our first programming assignments at Purdue. They told you exactly what needed to go in and exactly what needed to come out. I could build all these things with what you taught me, and I failed the assignment. Because they're like, no, that's not what a computer scientist does. A computer scientist is told what's going to go in, what needs to come out, and you deliver that in the most efficient way possible. So a very strict interpretation of computer science at the time that ended up changing my interest to say, I can always do that as a hobby, as a passion to learn computers. What I was really curious then about was, how do other people use it? Now, it's tough to go back to that time for a lot of people, but at that time, using computers and the internet were still novel ideas. And even at that point, when we think about the popularity of Apple computers, this is true on the Purdue University campus, primarily Windows machines. When those labs were all busy during midterms and final weeks, the labs that had Apple computers were completely empty. That was the time. That was the embrace of technology. It was a lot different than it was today. Even companies like Google, people were, where is this going to go with lingering concerns over the dot-com boom? But I had just that kind of interest. And so my time at Purdue was computer science on the side, but primarily figuring out how businesses and companies use it. And so I transitioned over to that business, but more entrepreneurial side, running a business for several years that helped companies take all this new technology and integrate it into legacy processes. How do you connect a real estate system that is built on pen and paper to an online web form? People were willing to pay me money at that time. And so I did that for several years after Purdue. And then eventually what happened was I realized how much I didn't know. And then this is exactly where the MBA comes in, where they're like, after a couple of years of work experience, come, pay us even more money. All the secrets we didn't tell you. It's like in New Age buying a video game, which I have a background in, but like buying a video game, you're like, this is a great game. And they're like, and imagine how much you can unlock if you give us more money. That's what the education system was like, but it was a promise fulfilled. So I had the option. I could stay in the Midwest, where I worried I'd work with the same companies, hang out with the same friends, build the same network. I could go south, Texas. I could go to the East Coast. And I wish I had a better explanation for this. But really what happened was when I was visiting schools, this is in December, I remember I'm leaving Chicago O'Hare, 9 degrees outside, right? Parking the car, I got the full parka on and everything else. I go out to Los Angeles, it's 74. It's sunny. They have heat lamps set up in the courtyard, which also confused me. I came back, I'm like, this is beautiful. And they got these heat lamps, and I'm like, what the hell's going on? But it all came together for me. I said, there's something here that's bringing me to this part of the country. And that's where I was at UCLA for 2 years with my MBA before coming up to Silicon Valley. And so moved after 25 years from Chicago out to the West Coast. I've been here ever since and just enjoying the technology, the innovation, and despite the tax and the expensive cost of living, the very nice weather.
I've been to Chicago. I actually was recruited there one time, and I remember it being extremely cold. And the wind hit my face. And I'm from upstate New York.
It's painful, right?
It was cold, yeah. But it is beautiful. And I didn't realize about the Finger Lakes beaches there. So in the summer, it's magical. I can totally identify with you that West Coast is a great place for weather and then also learning something. But it's a big investment. UCLA is a big investment. I guess you could have gone a little bit north. You could have considered maybe San Francisco or something.
They were all valid options. But I'll tell you, one of the things that's overlooked just passively is that when I went into UCLA, the job market is booming. You have your choice of where you can end up, growth on the horizon. They give you every MBA program, the glossy brochure. Look how much more money you'll make. Justifies the ROI. And then in 2008, in the middle of my program, the housing bubble pops.
Oh,
I had classmates who spent their summers after their first year at storied Wall Street firms with long legacies like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers.
Yeah, that crisis was, yeah.
They came back after their 80-hour weeks and they had no jobs. And then the finance people, what do we do next? Consulting. And consulting gets flooded. Demand slows down. They flood into marketing, to sales, to any jobs that they had. Recruiters stopped coming to campus. And I tell people oftentimes, I say, so it was a deliberate choice how you ended up in technology. No, it wasn't. I would have preferred an entrepreneurial route. I would have preferred probably other jobs that I was looking at the time. But what was fortuitous about it is I think a lot of people go into school with this idea of where they want to take their career, what they want their journey to be. And when you're really put in that picture, when I see this now with parallels in the current economy, where those jobs are harder to come by, it really challenges you to think to say, what are the unique skills that you actually learned? How do you create value? So it becomes less about you and more about what you can demonstrate for people that are going to make an investment of time and salary in bringing you on board. And so that led to a much different career path for me than I would have had if I self-selected. And I think that worked out.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It was great timing. And I think Google was just setting up their offices in LA too. So maybe proximity wise, did that help?
I'll tell you, I applied when I was leaving UCLA for countless jobs. I only had one company that actually gave me an offer. It was a company called SourceForge up in the Valley. And so open source directory, I think they held the distinction of the single greatest one-day gain in NASDAQ history. They made it through the dot-com bubble, leased out like 40,000 square feet of office space, I think in Fremont for 20 years. And then when I joined them, they were about 35 people. And it was funny because when I came to them and I was interviewing, I interviewed with the CMO. And he looked at me, he's like, okay. So I'm like, I certainly need a job. At that point, you really can't be picky or selective. I prefer to be paid as opposed to not. And so I'm not going to tell you I want to do this job. And so he looks at me, he's like, we don't have anybody doing data and analytics here. Can you do that? I said, yes, sir, absolutely. And in the back of my head, I'm like, I sure hope I can. I had no experience really in that up until that point, but that was what was fun about it, is that you figure, a lot of people go into these education programs saying they'll give me the path, they'll give me the credentials. I really approached it more like they gave me a toolkit to, can you figure out problems? Can you learn new things and adapt to challenges? And that's what it was at that first job. It was, this is a need that we have. Did you learn enough at school to be able to figure this problem out? And thankfully, either they believed me and I demonstrated that value, or they were overly kind. But it was actually at that period for more than a year and a half. I was at that company where they had their own. They had 2 or 3 rounds of layoffs while I was there. And when I asked the CEO at that time, a gentleman, Ken Langone, so I think he was the founder of the Home Depot. If you ever go to New York, you'll see the Langone School of something or other, that gentleman. And I asked him, I said, why are you even keeping me around? I'm like, here I am, a couple of years out of school, least experienced person you have. And he was honest. He said, you're one of the few people that are actually creating value. So that reason why I was initially hired ended up being the reason why I stuck around. And that was a good learning for me to say, it's not simply about learning everything in school, but it's really appreciating the frameworks and the tools they gave you to learn more on your own.
That's great that someone also saw potential in you as well, and they wanted to keep you around. Going back to your book, and I appreciate it being targeted towards someone that you care about extremely. What I enjoyed about it was that it was almost giving me the basics and simplifying something that could be very complex, which is data, and how to navigate presenting your ideas and analyzing it. I just want to briefly talk about long-term customer value and how you analyze that, because that is one of the main theses in your book. But I did also feel towards the end, it was heading towards talking about the different people on your team and how to work within that framework. Maybe you could just tell me a little bit about the long-term customer value and your kind of theses there.
I'll tell you, at the very core, the entire book is about being human and the trade-offs that we make. And so with data, we try to be very analytical and distill people down to numbers and interactions. Businesses will say, how many people came to my website? How many people bought? How much money did I make? And it's very easy to distill that down to a dashboard where every morning you log into your Excel spreadsheet and you're like, this is how much we sold yesterday. You give yourself a thumbs up. And the book was really to serve as a reminder to say, there's people behind there. We look at these and we assign strange terms like bounce rate. Here's how many people came and immediately left. People bounced. But we lose touch to say, no, that's someone's mother, that's someone's aunt, partner, brother that may have had a need for your business that you lost in that data. Or worse, for some people, they don't even engage in the conversation. They say, I'm not a data person, so I won't look at those numbers at all. And so actually the core of the book started not with telling everybody it's not this metric, it's that metric you should look at. It's actually taking a step back. And this is the reason why I use a lot of relationship stories in the book, is to say, you're a lot closer to greatness than you realize. It's not going further and further into data. Yes, some data is discussed in the book, but it's actually taking a step back and saying, if I didn't give you all this data to start, how would you look at your business? How would you look at success? Or if I told you this is the way that a business was being run today, is this how you would see a business being successful? And through some of the analogies and the stories as you saw, people read and they're like, no, this is absolutely ridiculous. And I say, good, why are you doing that today? And that's really what the challenge is. The challenge is not necessarily teaching anybody anything new. except about how to look at their business in a different, more human, more natural way. To move away from where we have to prove everything exactly with data to say, no, there's relationships, there's people, there's questions, there's curiosities, that these very human things, not data science things, that if you're able to integrate them into your business, will be better off. And so the natural position is, and you see this at the end, for the people here, I called it the third part of the book really self-improvement, which is if you keep on this relationship thing, it's like, in order to be better for your customers, you need to figure out how you can improve yourself, or for businesses, how you improve your team. And that was just a natural continuation, because the first part of the book is pointing to say, these are some very small, specific problems that businesses make. But it's also tied to this larger question around how human beings make decisions and how they arrive at the conclusions or answers they do. And similar to this entire conversation, never judging anybody by saying they're getting it right or they're getting it wrong, but just to say they're not being who they really are. And if they just simply approach that and appreciate that, they're going to make a lot more money and be more successful than just trying to follow a script or a metric has been done for the past decade.
And I think the life stage that I'm at, I feel like you can't feel your way through some of the stuff that you want to get to a higher level. To be pretty good, you can get there. But then I do think that what you present about data and measurement is critical to refining yourself and refining your business, for example. So I definitely appreciated that. I felt like the next book was heading towards navigating like corporates. And then I happened to be working on a book called Tournaments. Is that right?
Yeah. So we talked about the first book, and not purposefully, but just through process, being really towards my son. Now people will say, what was the motivating question? What were you talking to your son about? And in that case, it was explaining what the hell I did all day, or at least a part of it. And to bring that context in, I started writing Converted during COVID, where in the first 4 months, we saw hundreds of thousands of people die here in the US from COVID. And a gentleman I work with brought up, he said, do you know how selfish it would be if you died? I was like, that's an interesting way of putting it. But I was like, all right, I'll entertain that. I was like, why? And he's like, all the stories and all the things that you've learned through your career will be gone forever. Never come back. He's like, because you never wrote it down. So I said, all right, look at my son. I'm going to write down everything that I learned. I'm going to share that with you so at least you have the benefit of that knowledge and anybody else that comes across that book. So I wrote all that down and I said, okay, great. I got that out of my system. And then in the current context, I've been wondering more and more is to say 10 years. Actually, it's going to be about, say, it's closer to about 13, 14 years. He's going to graduate college. And the world's going to be a different place than it is today. AI continues to advance, job markets get better or worse, economies rise and fall. And I always wondered how I would answer the question if he sat down to me and said, hey, yeah, I get all the data and marketing stuff. That was book number 1. What did you find made you happy in your work? All right, the first book talks a lot about what companies should do. I don't talk a lot about, if at all, about myself. I share some stories, but I don't talk about those goals. But that's an important part. A lot of the first book I wrote talks about how you become profitable, how you grow your business, how you become better with your marketing budgets. But it doesn't answer that question to the individual about how you become happy. Now, it's not to say I have the answer for it, but similar to sharing the stories about marketing, I think that anybody would be disappointed, my son would be disappointed, if I at least didn't share my perspective, what I thought, what I learned, working with all these companies having these perspectives. Maybe not what makes me happy, but what have you found makes other people happy? Some of the challenges that I've had, I've worked with some people in this world that are incredibly wealthy. And some of them even commented, they're like, I know people that are, I have a jet. I know people that have multiple jets. I was like, what? And they're absolutely miserable. I said, let's talk about that. Why do you see that? Because everyone believes that if they have this amount of wealth, how could happiness is inevitable? I've met people who've lost everything and still find happiness. And so where it really comes is the revealing not only of what I've learned, but within the same context to say, I don't want this to be a self-help book as much as it is a memoir around the competitions and battles that we face, where we may be chasing prizes like money, like success, like titles that we think will provide that happiness, but really it may be a little bit closer than what we see. And so it's not necessarily to provide any answers, but just to give the audience things to reflect on, or as I'm writing it, my son, things to reflect on, so that I'm sure we'll have this conversation when he gets a little bit older. He's learning multiplication and division now. He's not asking the life questions. But I'll write it because I know those questions are going to come up. A certainty that we're going to deal with issues about getting a job, heartbreak with women, where to live and where to go to school, what major to pick. We're going to have those conversations. This book is a certainty. And I hope by writing it down that it helps other people who are wrestling with those questions right now. We're not that I'm going to tell them what the answers or the right job or how to build their life, but I'm going to say, I learned some things that are worth sharing and that I hope they appreciate.
I got to tell you that I don't know how I found you, but the algorithm found me. And then I kept reaching out to you. And on the third try, you responded. And I wanted to let everyone know that's how we ended up talking. And so definitely, I appreciate you're a hero to me for answering my call.
Thank you, Derek.
And I'm so happy to have you on the show. And then I'm excited about your new book too. Love the fact that you're sharing how, what makes you who you are. And I feel pretty good about who's steering the wheel over at Google, or at least advising the person on how to steer the wheel. So I want to quickly thank our sponsor, Sideshow Tea. It's awesome, single origin sparkling tea. I'm a big
Fantastic.
fan. And honestly, I hope to have you on again and we'll talk about your book. So thank you so much.
Look forward to it. Derek, thanks again for having me. Next time we'll do this in person, in a real studio, with hopefully more tea. But it's been great, and hopefully for the audience, it gives them just things to consider. I always tell people, even the companies that I advise, I'm like, I'm not here, again, to provide you with answers. I'm just here to challenge the way that you think. And then often they find out that they know already the answers and how to find them. It's just someone that provoked them to think about the challenges and problems in that way. Hope the audience took away the same here.
Thanks, Neil.